Okay, so I see the little thing up here says I have 30 minutes. So we're going to be running directly into the break, so I'm sorry that you don't get your cookies on time, but I'll do my best to make sure we move along. I did see a post earlier this week about the fact that in presentations like this, where you have a large number of people in a small room, a lot of times the carbon dioxide level in the room rises, and that puts people to sleep. So just take a couple of good deep breaths, because I don't want to see anybody asleep. Okay, that's my goal here, is not to have anybody sleeping. So I'm going to be talking about migrating to Kea. And have any of you heard of Kea? Do you know what Kea is? Okay, I see a few hands. Kea is a new implementation of a DHCP server that was originally part of ISC's Bind 10 platform. And when Bind 10 was split, it lived on within ISC. So if you ever see this logo, and there's some socks floating around that you might see somebody wearing socks that have this logo on it. And if you'd like a pair of socks, come up and talk to me afterwards. It's a new iteration of a DHCP server. So I'm going to talk a little bit about doing migrations first, just general migrations instead of specifically about Kea. My background comes from a long time working in university and ISP environments. I've worked for NSPs, and I've seen all the new as-a-service things come. They all have come since I was back at NC State in 1985. So I've seen it. I've worked for ISC actually multiple times. I continue coming back, and I actually really love the place. I've actually also worked at a number of IPAM appliance vendors. So in my role at those appliance vendors, one of my jobs was to assist in migrations. So we were looking at people's existing infrastructure and then moving them into the appliance or into the new software or whatever was happening. So I'm going to leverage that experience to help a little bit in thinking about, this type of a migration. So just as a question, how many of you have ISC DHCP deployed within your organization? And I would almost guess that even if you didn't raise your hand, it might be in there somewhere, and you don't actually even know it. So, I would not be surprised if almost everybody in here has either used it, currently uses it. So my observations are from experience. My first observation is migrations are hard. Have any of you done a migration of something like at the layer of the DHCP server? And did you enjoy it? No, of course not. It's hard. It's painful. It's something that you don't really want to do. But there are reasons that you have to do it. So, it's not that, gee, it's hard, we're not going to do this. It may be, gee, it's hard, but look at the benefits that we're going to get from doing this. Migrations are not always wanted or needed. We ran into a lot of people who the management layer said, we're going to be replacing our infrastructure with these new devices because the salesman over here said we need that. And then everybody at the operations level says, well, that's really kind of hard, and we really don't really see a need to do that because everything's working just fine as it is. And there were even problems with fiefdoms, because you had people that were the Unix DHCP administrators, and then you had the Windows DHCP administrators. You ever try to get those two guys, the two sets of people, to talk to each other and actually get anything done other than arguing about, well, if you click this, it's better, but no, if you type this, it's better? It ends badly. There are some really interesting, unexpected benefits of doing a migration. The first one is, and I will guarantee that this, unless you have a network that is like 5 machines and they all have reserved addresses, there's something about your network that you don't know. There is something about the configuration of your network that is going to really surprise you when you start unpinning things like DHCP. There's always something you don't understand about your DHCP configuration. So how many of you have, I know you said you were running it, how many of you have actually been involved in modifying an ISC DHCP configuration in your job? Okay, a significantly smaller number of people, so that's a good thing. There are so many options and so many ways of configuring things, and oh gee, that little box over there runs a little bit differently than everything else, so we're going to have to make a special case of it, and it's in that DHCP configuration. And unless you're the person who has been keeping that configuration from day one, you really don't know all of the little bits that are inside your configuration. Would you guys agree? Yeah. Surprise! That box doesn't boot anymore now that we turned off option 47 and God knows what it even did. So be aware of that. Your configuration may actually become simpler because all of that old cruft that was in your previous configuration, well, maybe you don't have any boot P devices anymore. Maybe all of that stuff has been phased out and now you can actually lop off half of your configuration, which is a good thing. Your configuration may actually end up documented, and that's a huge thing. So those of you that have the ISC DHCP but haven't been modifying it, haven't been changing the configuration, do you know who it is that actually modifies the configuration? And do you know that they're writing out good documentation as to what it actually does and how it works? How do you estimate the effort required to do a migration? And the first thing I'll tell you is that project managers are not always evil. When you're dealing with an organization where you have those multiple stovepipes, where you have your Windows guys and you have your Unix guys and you have your cloud guys, because they're even a little bit special too, and you need to talk to all of them about getting DHCP working similarly, it's really nice to have a project manager sitting in there where everybody can talk to them, and then it isn't anybody's fault except the project manager. It's a good thing. So work with your project manager, love your project managers, because they actually do help you out a lot. So look at them and realize that having to deal with all of the different personalities and people involved is really a difficult thing, and it's nice to have that project manager person around. The effort required and the time required are not going to be the same thing. The time required is going to be amazingly long. If you are in a complex network across multiple continents, across multiple data centers within each continent, the time required is big. The effort required is humongous, huge. It's big. How do you define these things? You know, well, the effort, what is the effort? The effort's going to be, well, first of all, we need to decide that, yes, we're actually going to do this migration. Followed by, well, what does our existing configuration actually do? How does it work? Then you're going to have to peel off the layers and make each of those, make the configuration actually work in the new product. That's going to take a lot of time. The additional piece where the time comes in is actually getting the work done. If you have a multinational organization running across multiple continents, 3 o'clock in the morning here on a Saturday may not be the optimal time to do that upgrade if you're if you're somewhere else. So be aware that the effort is going to be huge. The time is going to be a lot longer than you actually expect it to be. And I will tell you from personal experience, several small to mid-sized migrations over a planned period are much, much better than one large migration. You go in and you say, well, when you guys come in on Monday, DHCP is all going to be new, it's all going to be great, and so you decide to make the big change across huge organization overnight. You're setting yourself up for some real pain and suffering. So think about the organizations. Think about how your network is actually split up, and pick out individual pieces and look at migrating individual pieces instead of doing the whole thing at once. Go in, obviously, labs. Your lab network, That's going to be something that you're going to be able to need to test on. You're going to need to modify your lab network to start using the new software. Look at regional offices. Well, if it's out there at the end of the network wire and it takes us 3 hours to drive out to that facility, is that one of the best places to start a migration? Probably not. You need to consider all the mechanisms that you're going to have to deal with. Network, physical access, and everything else. When do you actually want to migrate, and why do you want to migrate? Well, infrastructure at rest tends to stay at rest. If you have a working DHCP configuration, you are never going to want to go in and make a change to it. Then that's fair enough. You really don't have a reason to. But sometimes it comes time and you just have to bite the bullet and do what you need to do. So when should you migrate? Well, when you are already doing another major infrastructure change, is that a wonderful time to change out your DHCP underpinning? No, it's horrible. You know, you've already got your network in pieces, in shambles, and this part of it's working, but that's not. And then everybody says, well, it's DHCP's fault. And you can't say, no, it's not, because it was working yesterday, because now you're saying, well, I don't think it is because we're running new code and the configuration kind of looks like it did yesterday, but I'm not really sure. That's not a good position to be in. How about when a new campus, a facility, or a remote office comes online? To me, that's a perfect time to do this type of thing. That remote office doesn't work anyway right now. That remote campus has never been up and running. Let's go ahead and bring them up on the new stuff. See how it works. Does it work? Does it do what we expect it to do? And if it does, we have lessons learned that we can now bring into our existing infrastructure. We're able to start looking at our tooling to see if our configuration tools, well, we just added a new server. Did it actually work when we entered, into the tool chain? And if it does, then you've learned a massive amount. End of life of existing infrastructure tools. How many of you are dealing with a vendor or vendors that have said, well, yeah, you have about 2 years to get off of this existing platform that you're using? Have any of you ever had to deal with that? That's no fun. And I'll tell you, if they tell you 2 years out, it's probably going to end up being more like 4, because everybody's going to be screaming when there's 3 months left going, but you can't turn it off. But I'll tell you, when they start giving you 2 years, it's time to start thinking and moving forward to the next platform. Because even though they may still be supporting it, it's not going to be the level of support that you're expecting, that you're used to. And always, if you have hundreds of available hours and tens of thousands of leftover budget dollars, that's the time to start doing your migration. And if you have that problem, please let me know. So, how do you go about doing a migration? Well, you document and review the existing configuration. Hopefully, it's already documented. Hopefully, it's easy to figure out what the existing configuration does. But I'm going to guess that it probably isn't really that easy. Something to think about here is it possible to consolidate, or would it be beneficial to distribute the functionality? So there's a lot of change of thought about DHCP. And one of the ones that I've seen more recently, which absolutely boggles my mind, is moving your DHCP servers to the cloud. Great idea. Great idea. I wouldn't think about doing it, but at least you'd have to convince me. You'd have to do some really hardcore convincing. That thing is going to be as close to the devices that it's serving as it can possibly get. I'm not going to put it out somewhere where I can't lay my fingers on it. I'm not going to put it out there somewhere where the packet, may vanish in transit, and when I say, where did it go, everybody's going to go, over there. Not my fault. That's hard. Consolidation of your DHCP, do you actually want it in a centralized, if you're running lots of small facilities out in remote places, Do you actually want DHCP servers in each of those locations? Possibly. You may not. You may want to bring it all inside. We're talking now a little bit specifically about Kea, and we're going to need to think about our deployment options. And one of the things that we did not have to deal with on ISC DHCP was things like, what database backend should we use? Because there was no database backend. You didn't have that option. Well, we got, how long has ISC DHCP been around? It's been around a couple of years, right? I have seen people that have done things with the leases database. They've pushed it out into other databases to use for certain things. I haven't really seen that everybody needs to do that. So one of the decisions that you need to make is on this availability of a database backend, is it something that you actually want to do? Is it a need of yours in your infrastructure to keep the leases or to keep the reservations in a database? High availability. We'll talk about this in just a minute. It's a little bit different between ISC DHCP and Kea. And then, of course, this is a great time to go out and say, hey, let's do IPv6 while we're at it. We're changing all of our other underpinnings, so we may as well at least give the machines an IPv6 address, even if even if we don't really use it. Something to think about. How do you translate a configuration? Well, I'll tell you, looking at an ISC DHCP configuration file, if you are a programmer, you recognize it as a programming language. It is not what you would consider as a standard configuration file. It isn't do these things, or have, here are my settings, and it goes and it happens. It is a programming language. That is not what Kea's is. So we have a major difference in how the configurations work. There is a tool now available called Keama, or Keama. It takes your ISC DHCP configuration and turns it into a Kea configuration to an extent. A lot of the people that have been working with Kea looked at the difference in configuration between ISC DHCP and Kea and said it is impossible to write a conversion application. You cannot convert an ISC DHCP into a Kea configuration file. And so one of our engineers said, you're right, it's absolutely impossible. He went off over a weekend and came back and said, here it is. So, you have those kind of people working in your organization, and they are fantastic. And he is absolutely right. He wrote a converter. Now, it's good, but because of the major differences between the way the Kea configuration works and the way the ISC DHCP configuration works, it is not complete. So manual translation or a rewrite may be possible or necessary depending on how weird and complex your configuration is. Going to the previous presentation, it was absolutely fantastic because it really fit in very closely with this. They were talking about the methodology of testing. The methodology of testing a DHCP configuration and a major modification of your DHCP infrastructure. How do you test 100,000 IP phones and 20,000 HP laser jets from God knows what years, and all of those PCs on everybody's desk and everything else in between? You have to work on this very hard, and the virtualized environment that they're talking about is really hard to create for DHCP. In addition to testing functionality, yes, okay, all of our devices booted up. Fantastic, we're happy, we're ready to go. The problem is you're changing infrastructure completely. You're now dealing with performance issues. Well, we've thought and we think that we need our leases in a database, and it's stored over there in San Jose. Our DHCP server is going to be over here in Palo Alto, and we're just going to run those leases back and forth, and our devices are actually sitting out at stores in various locations. And I'll tell you that that's going to be really painful, because when you start introducing the latency of writing your leases into a remote database on top of supplying a device with an IP address, you're going to have some really unhappy customers. You need to look at the options that are available to you, figure out what actually works well. You have Kea and the database running on the same machine or in very close proximity. It works great. You start doing these, well, our database administrator guy is over there and he runs all the databases on that machine, and life is going to be a whole lot more painful for you. Migrating leases. Existing leases may, at this point, need to be rebuilt from scratch because currently, at this moment, there is no tool to take an existing ISC DHCP leases file and convert it into a Kea leases database of any sort. This you can actually work around, and I've done it in the past. You lower the lease times, and then you change that, and you let it sit long enough that the leases are now getting that shorter time. And then when you pull out the old network or the old DHCP server and you put in the new one, you may have a couple of machines that want to fight each other over an address, but it's going to be a very limited period of time. So be aware of that. There has been discussion about a tool to do this, but at this point we do not have one. In performing and cutover, as I said earlier, little bits at a time, and whatever the definition of off hours is. What is off hours to here in this city versus that city over there versus the one that's three time zones over, 3 continents over? Who knows what is the best for them? Project management is going to be able to deal with this. Works out well. So I talked earlier, I mentioned very briefly about high availability. Well, previously with ISC DHCP, we had failover. Have any of you ever dealt with ISC DHCP in a failover configuration? I see no hands. I see two. Okay, I see a couple of hands. It does not surprise me that there are not a lot of people using this because I will tell you, it was a pain in the butt. It was not an easy thing to configure. Once you got it working, it worked really well, but in that interim period, it was easier just to say, okay, we've got a DHCP server, it works, it's probably not going to fail, we're just going to leave it, all's good. Kea actually implements high availability. So you're able to keep a hot standby of your DHCP server. So you have one up and running, it's sending its lease information over to the other one. The first one fails, it fails over to the second one. Very good stuff. Obviously, a major change in your infrastructure configuration. Option inheritance, I'm not going to go into this in any detail at all, but it is different between ISC DHCP and Kea, so you're going to have to read the manual. The conversion tool does not take this into account. You're going to need to go in and figure out how options are inherited and make sure that they work as expected. Configuration backend, something new in the most recent beta version of Kea is the ability to keep your configuration in a database. So now when you have 10 DHCP servers, you don't have to have 10 individual configurations. You have all of the configurations in a database. When the server boots up, it goes out to that database and says, give me my configuration. It then spools up and is able to serve leases. You're able to make changes at the database instead of going out to the remote machines to make the changes occur. Databases, I'm not going to get into it because I only have 6 minutes left and I got 38 slides to go. So host reservations, you can put in a separate database from your leases. So yes, you may want to have a reservation database. So you have all these machines that get the specific address every time. Put that in a separate database. Your leases, the high volume traffic, does not have to be in the same database. In fact, it's not in the same database. The lease database backend is storing all of your lease information out there on a remote database server. Is there a very high speed database already available to you? Do you have an administrator that's ready to take over, the receiving and transmitting of all of that data? And actually, is there a need to actually put this in the database? Maybe you need to do things for law enforcement compliance. Maybe you need to, be able to go back and look and see what address was given. That is still available. But if you want to go out and do queries against it, yeah, you might want to do a database, but it's not an absolute hard requirement. So the Kea Migration Assistant, or Keama, it's a branch of the legacy ISC DHCP server. It takes as input the DHCP configuration file. It provides as output the JSON Kea configuration. Sounds fantastic, right? And it is, because it gives you a really good start on how to do your migration. Kea is a little bit different than the ISC DHCP server because it actually runs two separate daemons, one for IPv4 and one for IPv6. So when you run Keama, you're going to run it once to create the IPv6 version of your configuration and once to create the IPv4 version. It recognizes when there is a known issue. Here is something in the ISC DHCP configuration that does not translate to Kea. And the neat thing about this is it is actually linked to the Kea GitLab. So when you run Keama, it produces an output file, and in that file, it gives you the issue number that is associated with the given problem. So converting lease files not supported, and I'll skip over that. Okay, so the only time this is going to really matter, other than the fact of every once in a while there'll be a little bit of a conflict between machines wanting to get the same address. If you are using OMAPI, or if you've modified the leases file and put leases into that file manually, that's the only things that are really going to affect the lack of ability to move the leases file forward. ISC is looking at additional tools. So there are a couple of technical issues that you can't just slurp in the ISC DHCP leases file and spit out a configuration database, a Kea database, but it's being worked on, being looked at. So if you want to look at Keama, you can go out to this URL, and it's going to be in the slides, I'm sure, in the ones that are available through NANOG. The wiki has information on how to run it, very simple install script, has man pages, command line stuff, man pages. Keama-4, I for input file, O for output file, simple enough, but there are a lot of assumptions. So here's a very, very simple ISC DHCP configuration file. We see one defined subnet, we see one defined host, and a couple of little options. If I run Keama-4-i home.conf-o home.kea, it's going to produce a much more verbose file. The input is 16 lines, the output is 70, and it's going to provide us with some samples of issues that are going to occur. So when I look at the output file, what I see is a comment, and I did the colorization. It's not actually colored. We don't do that. It's nice and plain text. This configuration declares some subnets but has no interfaces config. Reference Kea number 245. Well, Kea doesn't take options on the command line as to which interfaces to listen to. It's in the configuration file. That's not provided in the ISC DHCP configuration file, so there's a note, and it's going to be right at the top of the file that says you're going to need to add interfaces configurations. So if I go out to gitlab.isc.org, projects, Kea issues, and then 245, obviously referenced from that number, I see a comment from one of the developers. There's a real risk when converting an ISC DHCP server configuration to Kea to end up with a config, without interfaces. To add a wildcard interface does not really help. As it is a difference in models, there is nothing which can be done other than to be aware. Fair enough. We've documented the fact that this isn't going to work directly. You're going to need to make some changes. Moving on, the configuration. Max, and again, if you see something with 3 slashes, that's a comment introduced by the Keama configuration tool. Max lease time is not supported. Use default lease time instead. Reference Kea number 221. Well, I always thought that, min lease time, max lease time, and default lease time, that was just things that you always set in DHCP configuration. Well, it turns out that when Kea was being worked on initially, that was not something that was able to be modified within the configuration. So if we go out and look at the issue number 221, you see that ISC DHCP uses 3 values, max, min, and default, whereas Kea only uses valid lifetime. The 3 values are actually in the Kea code, but the configuration file was never written to allow that to be modified. You couldn't configure it, so the configuration parser didn't know how to do that. The valid lifetime is a mandatory configuration parameter, so it means that Kea is rigid. So even if you say, I want this address, you're not going to necessarily, or this timer, you're not necessarily going to get it. And I'm out of time. How bad am I over time? Right on time. Okay. And this issue goes on to explain a couple of other timers because they're all interrelated. So the neat thing about this is you can look at that and say, oh, okay, that's fine. I'll just use the default timer. All's good. If that's fine with you, that's great. However, if it isn't and you say, that really stinks, I really need to have that configuration option, you're in GitLab at this point. So you can go in and see that issue and say, okay, I'm a customer or I'm a user of Kea. I think it's important, and you can state your case. So I got in there and said the use of max lease time max lease time and min lease time in addition to default lease time is very common in existing configurations. Kea at this point does not support these. On behalf of customers, I'd like to request that these options be supported or that a document be produced explaining how to get the same effect with the available options. Well, nobody wanted to write a document, so it's being fixed in the code. We're now getting those other timers available. Moving along, everything here, we see a configuration that actually is correct. We see a subnet created. We see the options that are given to that subnet. We see a reservation, a hardware address, and we see the information provided with it. This configuration ran really smoothly through the migration tool. However, it was really, really, really simple. I actually removed dynamic DNS configuration from the example just so that it would fit within my now exhausted time. Other things that are not going to work, OMAPI configuration, because OMAPI is not part of the DHCP standard. It's part of ISC's add-ons. So it's going to tell you, again, in the comments, it's an internal ISC DHCP feature. This isn't going to work. Delayed-ack. The delayed-ack option is not supported. Again, you may need this, and if you do, go to the associated, actually you could open a Git ticket for this, open an issue. Update optimization false. Update optimization is not supported because we follow RFC 4702. Earlier versions of ISC DHCP used kind of an interim mechanism. Now it's supporting the RFC. And the worst thing, and I'll stop after this, here is something that you will find in a ISC DHCP configuration. If the substring of the option DHCP client configuration, starting at the first byte, going through the fourth byte, is RAS space, then we're going to ignore booting. So we're not going to allow this guy to boot if he is RAS, or we're not going to give him an address if he has the client identifier RAS space. This is what Keama produces. This isn't what you're going to want. Kea does have the constructs to be able to create those options and that configuration snippet, but Keama doesn't know how to do it. So you're going to get something like this that shows that there is a conditional if this is equal to left a substring of that and this and then the other, but you're going to have to do that modification yourself. And with that, Kea may or may not make sense for you at this time. Migrating is a huge undertaking, even in a very small environment. Keama is available, and the how-to is in the wiki. And I apologize for going over, and I know that we're at break. We're actually into break. So have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for attending NANOG, and if you have any questions, please see me after.